to Deep Sleep Stories. If these stories have helped you through restless nights, please leave a review. Reviews are what help this podcast grow, reach more listeners, and stay alive. Without them, even something meaningful can slowly disappear. So if this show has brought you comfort, that small act truly helps keep it going. Now, settle in, and let's begin.
Welcome to Deep Sleep Stories, where the day softens at the edges and your mind can finally set down what it has been carrying. Tonight you'll drift into a harbor at twilight and discover a quiet tea house where warm cups and gentle lantern light invite you toward rest. Settle yourself in the most comfortable way you can, letting your shoulders drop a little, letting your jaw unclench, letting your hands rest as if they have nothing more to hold. If it feels good, allow your eyes to close, or let them linger half-lidded, unfocused, as though you're already watching a distant shoreline. Take a slow breath in, easy and unhurried, as if the air itself is calm. And as you breathe out, imagine releasing the last small knots of the day. Another gentle breath in and out, as if your exhale can carry away any lingering noise. You don't have to do anything perfectly. You don't have to chase sleep. You only have to allow this moment to be exactly as it is and let it slowly change on its own. Picture yourself near water, not bright and busy water, but the kind that glimmers quietly at the end of the afternoon. You can almost hear it, the soft hush of small waves pressing against wood, the delicate clink of rigging somewhere far away, the faint cry of a seabird that sounds more like a lullaby than a call. The air is cool without being cold, brushed with salt, and there is a sweetness in it too, like damp cedar and distant tea leaves. With every breath, the scene becomes gentler. The sky deepens from pale to lavender, from lavender to a dusk blue that feels like a blanket settling over the world. Somewhere ahead, a few lanterns have begun to glow, warm as honey. You can sense a little place of refuge waiting for you by the harbor's edge. A tea house at twilight, quiet and welcoming. And as you breathe in and out, you begin to drift away from yourself, away from effort, away from the need to be the one moving through the story. The world will continue without your help. The water will keep its slow rhythm. The lanterns will keep shining. And now, very gently, the story will carry itself. In a small harbor where the docks were made of old, smooth planks and the posts were capped with worn brass, twilight arrived like a slow exhale. It spread evenly as though someone had drawn a soft veil across the rooftops and the masts and the waiting boats. The sea was calm, its surface a sheet of darkened glass that trembled when a ripple passed through. At the far end of the harbor, tucked between a net mender's shed and a stack of weathered crates, stood a tea house built on pilings above the water. It was not large. It did not try to impress. Its beauty was the kind that didn't announce itself. Quiet windows, a low roof with eaves that curved like a resting bird's wing, and a narrow walkway that led to a door painted the color of deep green seaweed. A sign hung near the entrance, carved from driftwood and smoothed by time. Its letters were simple, and their edges had softened as if the sea breeze had been reading them for years. Lanterns in round paper shades dangled from hooks beneath the eaves, their light already alive and steady. Each lantern glowed as if it held a small, patient sun. Inside, the tea house was warm without being heavy. The air held the soft perfume of steeping leaves, faint citrus peel, and the clean, comforting scent of cedar. The floorboards were polished by footsteps that had come and gone in a slow tide. A few tables sat near windows that looked out onto the harbor, so close to the water that one could watch the reflections shiver beneath the glass. The keeper of the tea house moved quietly behind the counter. Her hair, threaded with silver, was gathered at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple robe the color of storm clouds, and her hands knew the language of tea. There was no hurry in her gestures. She lifted a pot with the care one might use for a sleeping kitten, set cups in place as if aligning stars, and poured with a steadiness that soothed the room. A visitor arrived as twilight deepened. He was neither young nor old in any obvious way, because the harbor had a habit of smoothing sharp edges, including the edges of time. He carried a satchel made of canvas and a small notebook that looked as if it had traveled in many pockets. His coat was dusted with sea air. He stepped across the threshold and paused, not from uncertainty, but as if he were listening to the tea house breathe. The keeper looked up with a mild smile, the sort that made no demands. "You're welcome," she said softly, and the words settled like a feather. The visitor nodded. He did not speak immediately. He let the warmth wrap around him, let the quiet soak into his bones. Then he walked to a table by the window, the one where the harbor lights could be seen beginning to bloom along the dock, one by one, reflected twice, once in the air and once in the water. Outside, the harbor lived in a hush. Boats rocked gently, their hulls sighing against ropes. A fisherman passed at the end of the pier, moving like a shadow that meant no harm. Somewhere someone laughed briefly, and then the sound faded, swallowed by the softness of the evening. The visitor set his satchel down and rested his notebook atop it. He did not open it yet. He simply looked out at the water, and his gaze became slow. The keeper approached with a small tray. On it sat a teapot of pale clay, warm to the touch, and a cup that looked hand-thrown, imperfect in a charming way. Alongside the cup was a tiny dish, holding a thin slice of candied pear, the kind of treat that didn't shout sweetness but offered it gently. "This is harbor jasmine," the keeper murmured, pouring. "It likes twilight." Steam rose in delicate ribbons. It carried the scent of jasmine blossoms and something faintly mineral, like stones after rain. The visitor curled his hands around the cup, letting the warmth travel into his palms. He took a sip, and the tea was exactly as promised. Soft floral notes, calm and clear, with a lingering sweetness that seemed to glow at the back of the throat. He breathed out slowly, and his shoulders loosened. without him asking them to. The keeper returned behind the counter, and the tea house settled into its evening rhythm. The quiet clink of ceramic, the whisper of boiling water, the low creak of wood as the building swayed above the tide. It felt as though the whole room were a small boat, anchored not only to pilings, but to peace. The visitor watched twilight turn deeper. The sky shifted from blue to ink, and the first stars, faint, uncertain at first, appeared as pinpricks above the harbor's rim. The water answered them with a dim mirror, rippling them into wavering lines. As he drank, the visitor's thoughts began to drift. Not in a sharp, darting way, but in the way leaves drift on a stream, turning slowly, catching on eddies, then moving on. A day of travel, of noise and roads and voices, faded until it felt like something he had read about rather than lived. The tea house seemed to notice this change, or perhaps it simply supported it, the way a pillow supports the head. The lanterns glowed steadily. The walls held the quiet. The keeper moved with the same calm grace, as if she were tending a garden made of steam and silence. When the visitor's cup was half empty, the keeper brought a small bowl covered with a lid painted with a faint motif of waves. She placed it on the table without a sound. "What is that?" the visitor asked, his voice low. "Sea mist broth," she said. "Nothing strong, just warmth. It helps the body remember it can rest." He lifted the lid and found a pale, clear broth with a few floating slivers of kelp and a single thin slice of ginger. The scent was clean and soothing. He sipped, and it seemed to carry the harbor's gentleness inside him, salt, warmth, and a quiet steadiness. Outside, the tide shifted. The waterline moved almost imperceptibly, and the tea house swayed with it, a subtle motion like a lullaby rocking. On the wall near his table hung a framed map. It was not a map of roads and cities. It was a map of currents. Fine lines traced the sea's invisible pathways, curling and looping around the bay. Tiny symbols marked places where the water ran warm, where it ran cold, where it carried glow plankton in the darkest hours. The map seemed to shimmer slightly in the lanternlight, as if it were alive. The visitor stood and approached it, drawn as if by a soft thread. He leaned closer. The ink was faded, but the lines were precise. Beneath the map, in smaller script, was a phrase that looked like a poem, though it might have been a note to someone long ago. "Where the tide turns, rest follows." He read it once, then again, letting it settle. It felt like advice, offered without insistence. And the keeper noticed him there and spoke from behind the counter, her voice barely above the kettle's whisper. "The harbor has its own ways," she said. "People come here when their thoughts are too loud. The water teaches them something quieter." The visitor turned slightly, as though not wanting to break the spell of the map. "What does it teach?" he asked. The keeper smiled, and her smile carried patience, the way a shell carries the sound of the sea. "That you don't have to hold everything," she said. "The tide takes what's ready to go." The visitor returned to his seat, feeling the truth of that phrase sink into him. He wrapped his hands around his cup again, now nearly empty, and let the warmth linger. The tea house, as if responding, offered him another cup without being asked. The keeper brought it and poured a different tea this time, darker, richer, with a scent of toasted grain. "This is Twilight barley," she said. "It grounds you." He sipped, and the flavor was gentle and nutty like warm bread. It settled in his chest like a small, steady stone of comfort. He leaned back in his chair and watched the harbor. More lanterns lit along the docks, and their reflections stretched across the water like golden paths. Boats rocked softly, their movements slow, predictable, safe. A bell chimed from somewhere, perhaps a buoy, perhaps a distant clock, its sound round and soothing. In the corner of the tea house, near a shelf of small jars, a cat slept curled into itself like a comma in a sentence. Its fur was the color of toasted cream, and its breathing was slow and even. Every so often, its ear flicked, as if it were listening to dreams. The visitor's gaze drifted to the shelf. The jars held tea leaves of different kinds, each labeled with handwritten tags: moon silver oolong, dockside mint, kelp blossom, star anise black. Some labels had tiny doodles, waves, lanterns, little boats. The keeper's handwriting was careful but not fussy, as if it belonged to someone who understood that beauty could be simple. A small wind brushed the tea house. It was not a cold wind, but a cool one, bringing the scent of the sea inside. The paper lanterns near the windows trembled, their shadows fluttering over the walls like slow-moving fish. The visitor felt something change, subtle like the moment between waking and sleep. The tea house seemed to grow larger, not in size, but in presence. Its quiet was deeper. The lantern light looked softer. The harbor outside appeared slightly farther away, as though the window had become a gentle boundary between worlds. He blinked slowly. Across the water near the mouth of the bay, a faint glow appeared beneath the surface. At first it looked like reflected light, but it moved on its own. It drifted in a slow arc, then vanished, then returned, a pale ribbon under the waves. The visitor leaned forward, curious but not excited. Curiosity here felt mild, like the interest one might take in cloud shifting. The keeper, noticing his attention, approached again. She did not look surprised. "The glow is here," she said softly. "What is it?" the visitor asked. "Sometimes," she replied, "the tide brings in the lanternfish. They swim beneath the docks. They like the warmth and the calm." The visitor watched the glow drift closer. It moved like a gentle thought, not sharp, not urgent. As it neared, the water beneath the tea house brightened, faintly illuminating the pilings. Shadows turned into soft gradients. The harbor seemed to breathe with light. The visitor felt his own breath synchronize with it. Slow, steady, unforced. The keeper placed a small object on the table. It was a smooth stone, pale gray, with a faint line of pearly sheen running through it like moonlight caught in rock. "Hold this," she said, "if you'd like." He picked it up. It was warm as if it had been sitting in sunlight, though the night had already deepened. The stone fit perfectly into his palm, and he found his fingers curling around it without effort. "This is a tide stone," the keeper murmured. "People say it remembers the sea's steady rhythm." He held it and stared out the window. The lanternfish glow continued its slow dance beneath the surface. It painted the water in faint, moving patterns. And with each shift of light, the visitor's thoughts grew quieter, as if someone were dimming a lamp inside his mind. He did not feel as though he were falling asleep. He felt as though he were being carried. The keeper returned to the counter. She began to prepare another infusion, this one in a small glass pot. In the lantern light, the water looked like liquid crystal. She placed a few pale petals inside, tiny blossoms that opened slowly in the heat. She set the pot on a small warmer, and it began to glow with its own gentle light. The visitor watched from his seat. Even that small ritual, petals, steam, a quiet flame, felt like a story, told without words. Outside, the harbor's sounds softened further. The fisherman's footsteps were gone. The distant laugh had long since faded. Even the seabirds had fallen silent. The only sounds were the slow lap of water, the occasional creak of wood, and the faint song of a kettle breathing steam. The visitor's eyelids grew heavier. He blinked, and the time between blinks lengthened. The tide stone remained warm in his hand, anchoring him to the present moment in the gentlest way. In that drowsy space, he began to notice details he might have missed before. The faint pattern carved into the teahouse's wooden beams, like waves repeating. The way the lantern light seemed to pool in the corners, making them feel cozy rather than dark. The soft, clean lines of the counter where the keeper worked, worn smooth by years of quiet evenings. A small chime hung near the door, made of thin shells and sea glass. It barely moved now, but when it did, it sounded like a whisper of music, delicate, bright, and brief. The keeper came to the table again and set down the glass pot with the blooming petals. She poured the tea into a small cup. The liquid was pale gold, and the petals inside the pot drifted like tiny boats. "This is night bloom," she said. "It's very gentle." The visitor took the cup. The warmth met his lips, and the flavor was soft, floral, faintly sweet, with a coolness that felt like clean air. As he swallowed, he felt something inside him loosen, like a knot untied without being tugged. He set the cup down and looked at the tide stone in his hand. The pearly line caught the lantern light and seemed to glow. The visitor felt a strange, pleasant sensation, as if the stone were not only warm, but quietly alive, humming with a rhythm that matched the harbor. He closed his fingers around it and listened, not with his ears, but with that deeper part of attention that exists when the mind is quiet. He felt a slow pulse, in, out, like breath, like waves, like sleep. The tea house swayed almost imperceptibly, The visitor's body responded by relaxing further, as if it had been waiting for permission. At the window, the lanternfish glow drifted directly beneath the tea house. The water below brightened to a soft, underwater moonlight. Shadows became gentle shapes. The pilings looked like dark trees rooted in a sea of luminous silk. The visitor's gaze softened. The world seemed to blur slightly at the edges, as though it were turning into a dream. And then, without any sharp transition, something quietly magical occurred. The reflections on the water began to shift, not wildly, not in a way that would startle, but in a slow, story-like way. The lantern reflections stretched longer, and within them faint images appeared. A small boat gliding through mist, a lighthouse blinking in a distant fog, a shoreline lined with stones that glimmered like pearls. The visitor did not question it. In the tea house at twilight, questions felt unnecessary. The harbor could show what it wished, and the mind could simply watch. The keeper spoke softly, as if narrating a lullaby. "The water remembers," she said. "It remembers every calm evening, every lantern lit, every cup shared in quiet." The visitor's breathing slowed. His shoulders sank into the chair. The tidestone's warmth seeped into his palm and up his arm like comfort spreading. He watched the water's reflections continue their gentle transformations. Now he saw an old wooden bridge over a narrow inlet, lit by small lamps. Now a path through dunes, the grass is bending in a patient wind. Now a small cottage with a window, glowing, inviting, and safe. Each image appeared and faded like a sigh. None demanded attention, none asked to be understood. They were simply there, like passing clouds. The tea house cat stirred, stretched one paw, and curled back into sleep. The shell chime near the door gave a tiny, sleepy sound, then settled again. The visitor's notebook remained closed. He did not need to write. The harbor was writing for him, in light and water and warmth. The keeper returned to her work, placing more tea leaves into jars, wiping the counter with slow strokes, tending the kettle. Everything she did seemed designed to slow time, or perhaps to reveal that time had always been slow here. Outside, a thin fog began to drift into the harbor, rolling in low over the water. It was not thick, not threatening. It was a soft fog like breath on glass. It curled around the boats and the docks, making the lanterns look slightly haloed. The visitor watched as the fog carried the lanternfish glow, diffusing it into an even softer light. The water beneath the tea house now looked like a quiet sky turned upside down. He blinked again, slower than before. In that slow blink, he felt himself slipping deeper into ease, not losing control, not falling, but sinking gently into something supportive, like lying down on a bed that has been warmed for you, like letting your head rest against a pillow that fits perfectly. The keeper approached with one more small offering, a folded cloth, thick and soft, the color of warm sand. for your hands," she whispered. The visitor laid the cloth over his lap, then rested his hands beneath it, still holding the tide stone. The warmth became even more comforting, contained, and steady. He leaned his head slightly back, allowing the chair to support him. His gaze drifted to the lantern nearest his window. The paper shade glowed steadily, and its light seemed to pulse with the same slow rhythm as the stone, as the water, as breath. The harbor became quieter still. The fog thickened just enough to blur the far shore. The world felt smaller, more intimate, as if the tea house and the water beneath it were the only things that mattered. The visitor's thoughts were now few, and each one was soft, like a feather landing and then lifting away. He felt himself floating between waking and sleep, a gentle in-between where nothing needed to be done. In that space, he could hear the subtle music of the tea house, the kettle's hush, the wood's creak, the water's lap, the faint clink as the keeper set a cup down. The keeper dimmed one lantern slightly, then another, leaving only a warm glow near the counter and a softer one by the windows. The shadows grew deeper but not darker, cozy rather than empty. The visitor's eyelids lowered halfway, then more. The water's reflection slowed, becoming simpler again. Just lantern light and fog and the faint glow below. The lanternfish drifted on, their light fading as they moved away, like dream images dissolving into the dark. The visitor's breathing was now slow and even. His face relaxed. The tide stone remained warm in his palm, as if it were holding a small piece of the harbor's calm for him. Outside, the tide turned again. The tea house swayed gently with the shift, rocking like a cradle. The visitor did not resist it. His body accepted the motion as natural. His mind followed, easing further down. The keeper looked toward him once, checking as one might check on a candle to make sure it is burning safely. She saw his softened posture, the stillness in his shoulders, the way his head rested comfortably. She nodded to herself, satisfied, and moved with quiet steps to the back room. In her absence, the tea house did not feel empty. It felt held. The lanterns continued their steady glow. The fog continued its slow drift. The water continued its patient, repeating song. The visitor, now very close to sleep, felt the boundary between himself and the harbor grow thin. The warmth of the tea lingered in his chest. The warmth of the stone lingered in his hand. The warmth of the lantern light lingered in his eyes, even as they closed. The world became simpler. Breath in, breath out. Water in, water out. Light shimmering, then settling. And as the story begins to quiet itself, the tea house at twilight remains exactly as it should be. Calm, safe, and softly mysterious, floating above a sea that knows how to soothe. The visitor's fingers loosened slightly around the tide stone, not letting it fall, just holding it more gently as if sleep were already guiding his hand. His shoulders sank deeper, his jaw softened, his brow smoothed. The fog outside thickened a little more, turning the harbor into a gentle dreamscape. The boats became silhouettes. The lanterns became warm dots of light. The water became a dark, breathing blanket. Inside, the teahouse was hushed. The cat slept on. The shells by the door were still. The air held only the faintest scent of tea, as if it too were drifting toward sleep. Everything slowed. The visitor's breath became a soft tide of its own. In and out, steady, easy, unforced. The chair held him, the cloth warmed his hands. The harbor held the tea house, the sea held the harbor, the night held the sea. There was nothing left to do, nothing to solve, nothing to remember. Only this gentle drifting, only this quiet warmth, only this soft twilight harbor where lantern light and water speak the language of rest. And now the story eases toward silence, letting each sentence become smaller, softer, like footsteps fading down a hallway. The lanterns glow, the water hushes, the fog wraps the docks, the visitor sleeps. Good night, dear traveler. Sleep well.